Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. The temperature here in Washington, D.C. has just started to cool a bit, and the humidity seems to have dropped finally as we enter the last weeks of September. I'm always excited for autumn to start, raking leaves, sitting us out around the fire pit, eating warm dinners cooked in the slow cooker, drinking mulled cider and mulled wine, and swapping out linen and cotton yarn so I can knit with wool. Of course, one of the very best parts of the coming of autumn is that it's the time when we get to start planning out our TBRs for Victober. I start dreaming about it right after Jane Austen July in general. So here is my Victober 2021 TBR. First up, Lucy the Reader challenges us to read a Victorian book with a female main character. Very recently, I did a review for publication of Fiona Sampson's biography of Elizabeth Barrett Browning. In order to prepare for that review, I poked through Barrett Browning's novel in verse, Aurora Leigh, but I didn't have time to read it as carefully as I wanted to. Barrett Browning was an extremely well-known poet in her day, really helping to create the cultural changes that we now call the Victorian period. She's known for her sonnets, but also for this more innovative form she uses in Aurora Leigh, her novel in verse. In addition to being an interesting form, I'm also fascinated by its subject matter, the main character's development into a writer, and a female writer at that. In addition to talking about the novel, I'll talk just a bit about the Fiona Sampson biography as well. The next challenge comes from Kate Howe, who asks us to pick out a sensation novel. Actually, in preparation for Victober, I just reread an old favorite, Mary Elizabeth Braddon's The Doctor's Wife. I promised to talk about it elsewhere very soon, so I won't go into detail here about this particular book quite yet. The third challenge comes from Katie at the great channel Books and Things. She suggests that we read a Victorian book set in the city and or the countryside. That is, a book set in an urban place, a book set in a rural area, one of each type, or a book set in both a rural and an urban place, which seems fairly common in big Victorian novels. My goal for this challenge is to read Daniel Deronda, written by George Eliot. Much of this book takes place in various parts of London, although there are other settings as well. I have really loved the George Eliot books I've read so far, so I'm very much looking forward to starting Daniel Deronda. In fact, last year for Victober, I read a fantastic book by George Eliot set not in a city, but in a small town, Middlemarch, and I absolutely loved it. This year, I think my husband David is going to join in the Victober fun and read Middlemarch. He has a lot on his plate right now, but I hope he'll be a guest here on my channel, perhaps near the end of October, but probably near the end of November, and talk about Middlemarch, as well as some of the other books he's been reading lately. I can't wait. If I can find time during Victober, I'd love to pick up Gertrude Himmelfarb's Jewish Odyssey of George Eliot. Daniel Deronda is her most Jewish-oriented book, one that I've heard is not necessarily the way Jews today would most like to be portrayed, but nevertheless a book that was quite sympathetic to the position of Jews in England during the Victorian period. Assuming I won't have time to read Himmelfarb, perhaps I can read it during the next bookish celebration, Nonfiction November. A Victorian novel that doesn't have the same reputation for being sympathetic to the plight of Jews is The Way We Live Now by Anthony Trollope. I had not intended to read this book during Victober, and I'm not sure I really have time, given it's absolutely enormous. But there are at least 3 reasons why I think it would be a great choice. First, I would love to spend some time thinking about different ways Victorian authors confronted the position of Jews and Judaism so near a time when an ethnically Jewish man served as prime minister. That man, Benjamin Disraeli, became an Anglican fairly early in his life. He was also a novelist, and I read his novel Tancred for Victober 2 years ago. It's not one I recommend, although reading it was definitely an interesting experience. The second reason that I'm interested in reading The Way We Live Now is because it's a book I listed on my bucket list tag recently, a tag put together by Sean the Book Maniac. And putting my answers together really made me think about prioritizing those books a little more than I have so far. And the third reason to consider Trollope for my TBR is because Steve Donahue and Jordan Parsons will be hosting a read-along. Having a guide who knows this book as well as Steve does sounds like an opportunity not to be missed. Still, I have quite a bit on my plate in October. As I mentioned earlier, I write book reviews for publication, and one review I'll be writing in October, although the book itself won't be published until November, is a new biography of the early years of H.G. Wells, written by Claire Tomerlin. In preparation for that review, I might decide to reread Wells rather than bite off the very long Trollope novel right now. I will be at least poking through some of his early books, like The Time Machine, The Invisible Man, and War of the Worlds. Luckily, all of these choices, Trollope's The Way We Live Now, as well as the 3 Wells books, and actually Daniel Deronda too, were bestsellers the year they were published. So any of them will meet the general Victober challenge to read a popular work. The group read this October is the collection of stories called Gothic Tales by Elizabeth Gaskell. I don't think I will be able to read most of the stories, but I would really like to read the novella Lois the Witch, a piece of historical fiction about an English girl who moves to Salem, Massachusetts, and becomes involved in the Salem witch trials. And finally, the last suggestion for this year's Victober is to read aloud a section of a Victorian work or have it read aloud to you. My husband and I often read together, and we've started chatting about what we might choose to read aloud this month. And I hope we can have tea and scones, perhaps, while we read together. And perhaps we can film a bit of our celebration as well. On top of that, I want to do a little bit of reading aloud on this channel. For those of you who don't know my channel well, I not infrequently read or perform a poem or sometimes a story here. And I have one in mind for the end of the month, a story written during the Victorian period but not in a country where Victoria reigned. I'm looking forward to putting it together. All right, I can't wait for Victober to get started, and I'm looking forward to hearing all about your reading adventures too. I don't think I associated Victorian literature with autumn in any way before I discovered BookTube, but Katie and all her associates have totally made that link absolutely indelible for me. Thank you very much for joining me here today as I start putting my Victober TBR together. See you soon here on Hannah's Books.